and Chris Williams are going to be talking about fluxes between the forest and the atmosphere. And they will each have 10 minutes. So I'll hold up a sign letting them know when they have 3 minutes left, and then I'll stand up when they have a minute left. That was the one I found first.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here today. Not home building on my house like in West this time last year. So I'm going to tell you a long-term view of carbon budgets. So I'll cut right to the chase. This is our long-term data record showing the net ecosystem exchange, which is the carbon from the atmosphere, here in this case, into the forest. It's going down, that's a negative number. And starting in 1992 and going to the data has been processed into annual sums up to 2008, and there's been an increase in the amount of carbon flowing into the forest, which we thought, well, that's kind of a surprise. We're a middle-aged forest that's supposed to be going towards an equilibrium, and it's not. The little green things here, the green lines are the above-ground net primary productivity, which we measure from adding together the wood increment and the growth of new trees into our size class, plus the litter, which you'd think, well, litter shouldn't really stick around forever, so maybe it's fortuitous that they match, but it's that there's been a little bit of a trend, well, not quite as strong, but it gives us some confidence that what we measure in the atmosphere seems to be showing up on the ground in the forest, so we're not making a big mistake. In the bottom, we can use sort of a model based on temperature response of the nighttime ecosystem exchange to predict what the ecosystem respiration is, and subtract that from the net to predict what the gross uptake is. So this is kind of a model-based partitioning of the net CO2 exchange into its outward and inward components. And there's been an appearance of a trend of the ecosystem uptake has been increasing over time. And one thing you'll notice is that the magnitudes of these are large compared to what the difference. So this difference, the thing that's a real number is this number with a difference between those two. Since this partitioning is a model, we can it's a little bit iffy whether you can put a lot more uncertainty on those. And so we have confidence that this trend, it looks like, well, maybe this is starting to turn around, so we don't expect this trend to go on forever and ever, because there's an upper limit to how big these forests can go. Somebody this morning said, it's 200 grams or 300 kilograms or so, but we're not there yet. So now let's see, where is that carbon on the forest? I'll start from the ground. We measure litter input, so we have baskets out in the forest, and we go out every fall and we collect all the leaves in the basket, and we weigh them and sort them, which takes a long time. So we have undergraduates in the lab spending spend all winter coming in and sorting out. So we're a little bit behind on the data, and we're not going to quite meet our requirements. But this is showing you just the leaf litter, the little woody bits, and then the flowers and acorns from 98 when we started doing this annually to now. We're adding 1.5 to 2 tons of carbon, and there's maybe a hint of a trend, but not that much. And we also, as I said, sorted out into species. So the red is there's maple. That accounts for most of the litter, which we also can see from looking at the trees. That's what most of the trees are. And then there's a little bit of other. Maybe there's an increase in how much litter is coming in, but it's not easy. So as I said, maybe there's a little bit of increase, but we're a few years behind. So to be really able to answer that, we're going to have to sort the rest of that and weigh it. And one point to make is that if you compare that 1.5 to 2 tons, that's only 1/10 to 1/5 the annual respiration number. So there's a lot of carbon going into the forest through the below ground, through the roots and things that's not coming. So the leaf litter that comes in the fall is not the main source of carbon that's being respired. And we wouldn't, you know, it's kind of an open question. How long does that litter last? It's not piling up to a meter deep of dead leaves, so it's probably a lot of it's going away, and what remains is there's ways to get at that, and some soil carbon work looks at that, but I don't have a good answer for you today of how much of that litter input counts as long-term storage. There's certainly a lot of carbon already in the forest floor, and there's a sense that a lot of that carbon is fairly old. So what's down in the forest floor has been there for a while. You can use some C14 ages and find that it's 100 to 300 years. Where the range is the difference between the fine fraction and the coarse fraction. And so the carbon that's in the soil has been there for centuries, but that may be accumulations of a small amount that's annual. There's an experiment being done close by the EMS tower where they brought some enriched C14 enriched litter as an experiment to put that on little plots and see what the fate of the carbon-14, so they can, from this experiment, get an estimate of what the retention of carbon, what the transfer from the litter into the forest floor is. And one thing we have talked about over time is something we ought to do, but we haven't really done consistently, is get a better, or as a better way to see what the growth of the forest floor is. Put little markers in there and do some stratigraphy after a few years and see what's left. What about the above ground? But the carbon in the trees, which is, so here's showing the growth increment, which is taken from going out and measuring the diameter of trees a few times every year, getting the change from one year to the next, and then multiplying that change in diameter with some equations that predict the volume of a tree from the diameter. And we can see that these are constant because we just did a measurement here, so this is the mean across there. But it's been going up, and this is the growth. The green is the trees that have grown into the size class, which is the trees are greater than 10 centimeters. And trees are also dying, but at a small rate compared to their growth. Once the trees die, it doesn't mean they go away. They're still out there. They take a long time to fall down and to rot. And where is the wood? This is in their size class. This is the trees that we measure every year, the greater than 10 centimeters. And then this is the trees that are 5 to 10 and 1 to 5 that we go out and measure once in a while. Most of the action is in big trees. And this is just looking at, this is the total amount of wood that's there. When we started measuring it, it was a little over 100 tons, and we're up to 120. There's a small but not insignificant, and also slowly rising. This is the dead wood, the branches and trunks and things that are laying on the ground, decaying away slowly. They're there. They're important, but they're not huge. So 90% of the carbon above ground is in the big trees. So if you want to, have to know very much about the other ones, the living biomass has been going up, and which I think was alluded to in one of the talks, that it's been growing. I think the control plot for one of the sites is growing. It's not a steady control. It's dynamic. And what happens to the woody debris? We can use some. It's probably at least 10 years for its lifetime, but that's something we want to know more about. Since it lasts a long time, it takes a long experiment to see what its fate is. And thoughts for the future. I think we need to look at, in this, probably not, it's, I think, kind of obvious that the carbon budget needs to be considered as a number of pools with variable residence times. And because of those residence times aren't all in sync. When you can get a shift in say input in one pool, it takes a while for that to work through, so that may cause a trend. Just you get a short-term trend from that. We need to have, I think we need to know better, what are these kind of middle range things. There's some things that have that last for a long time, and some that are gone in a year. You want to know the ones in the middle, and what's going on below ground. I haven't talked to you about that because we haven't been digging it up. And there's a lot of synergy between these, and the big question is what's the ultimate carbon stock, and will it get to a steady state, or is it? And compare these to what things, and I think that leads into what Chris might talk about, which is more comparing to other sites and effective facilities.
So I'm relatively new to Harvard Forest as an investigator here. It's a real privilege to get the chance to tell you a little bit about something that I've been up to in my first 3 years really at Clark University as an assistant professor. It connects to an ongoing National Science Foundation project that I have funded to explore essentially FluxNet synthesis. That could be regional syntheses or global syntheses across the FluxNet network. The one I'm going to tell you about today is this regional synthesis here at Harvard Forest. So I've titled this Comparative Analysis of Ecosystem Physiology in Co-Located Mid-Latitude Forests at Various Stages of Development. Melanie Vanderhoof is performing part of her PhD at Clark, working with me on this project, so I want to acknowledge her, as well as Bill and Julian and a variety of other people who have been instrumental in collecting a lot of these data sets that I'll be telling you about today. So this is the network that you're probably well familiar with by this point. Is there a pointer up here?
It's
Oh, we're gonna, okay. So you're familiar with the Little Prospect Hill site, the Hemlock Tower, the EMS Flux Tower, and here's the new one in the yellow star. That's a Clearcut site up on Prospect Hill, where I've recently instrumented a new flux station to observe what's happening in a Clearcut that occurred in 2008. Given the limited amount of time, I'm going to just have you draw your attention to 3 main features that characterize these different locations. First of all, we have a suite of parameters at the Clearcut site, Little Prospect Hill, and so forth. The dominant species differ across these. The forest age differs across these, and the growing season leaf area index is another context for the flux observations that I'll be presenting. We generally see low leaf area index and, of course, young stand age. At the Clearcut site, although things are vigorously regenerating, blackberry was one of the dominant species. We see a lot of knotweed and polygonum, as well as some ferns that came in quickly in year 1, some elderberry, and now seedlings and saplings have come in year 2, following clearing. It's going to eventually evolve, we believe, towards what we see at the Little Prospect Hill and or the EMS station, where we have red oak, red maple mixtures of various ages. And perhaps ultimately it would have ended up towards this hemlock site if it wasn't for that HWA. So in a sense, one can conceive of this or conceptualize these as being arrayed as a kind of a chronosequence across the landscape. And the basic objective of this work is to characterize the carbon, water, and energy consequences of these different land cover types all in the same climatic setting. So it'll be an integrated synthesis across these 4 flux tower sites. The one that you'd be least familiar with is this Clearcut site. It was cut in September to November of 2008. It was a traditional commercial harvest in a white spruce plantation. There was an awful lot of coarse woody debris that was left behind, and we have some estimates of just how much. It was instrumented with this eddy flux tower, sonic anemometer, and ergon, a whole suite of soil arrays and so forth that are characterizing the post-Clearcut microclimatic conditions. That was in June 2009. We had operation, and it's been in operation continuously since then, so we're still collecting data today. This photo was from July 2009, and you can see that even in that mid-summer, mid-first growing season, there still wasn't a whole lot of green, at least from this angle. And we're rapidly monitoring the vegetation change, the change in the coarse woody debris, as well as measuring the surface to atmospheric changes of carbon, water, and energy. So this is another photo journal of the site. Again, July 2009, we see some ferns, and on the other side we see quite a bit of elderberry and some knotweed. By June 2010, essentially a year later, or in July 2010, we start to see some reasonably high vegetation. And this is Sophie Dillon, if you know her. She was out there making a bunch of observations of leaf spectra and leaf scale observations of fluxes, leaf fluxes. And we've been monitoring and measuring the seedling density, composition, a whole suite of basic ecological and edaphic factors that help us understand and characterize the changes that we'll be observing in carbon, water, and energy exchanges. So that's at our own particular site, rapidly revegetated. The next series of figures are all going to have the same basic layout. And it's a little bit complicated, so I'm going to take a precious moment to orient you to this. In the dark blue bar, we have the Clearcut in its first year post-harvest. Then we have the second year, 2010, in Clearcut. The traditional EMS site, Middle Prospect Hill, intermediate age site, and the Hemlock Station. I'm showing that with, hopefully you can see in the back, December, January, and February averages, or actually often integrals. March, April, May, broken up into these 3-month climatic seasons, and then the annual integral. Okay. This is just one way to reduce and simplify and compare across these different stations. So what I was actually showing you there first is what we estimate as the seasonal average, seasonal total gross ecosystem productivity expressed in grams of carbon per square meter, as well as the annual total. I'm going to black it out just to draw your attention to the first contrast of interest. We're comparing principally the dark and lighter blues. That is the first year and the second year during summer. Gross ecosystem productivity was actually quite high, even in just 1 year in that first growing season. It is about half of the EMS station in midsummer. And in the second year, it starts to look a lot like the Hemlock Tower. So gross ecosystem productivity, the basic idea there is it was higher in the second year, but it was already even fairly high for a recent Clearcut in the first year. So vegetation is colonizing and productivity is going gangbusters quite rapidly. If we look at a different time of year, for example in spring, we see that the productivity in the Clearcut in March, April, and May of last year was actually far higher than what we see in the EMS station. That's really not a major surprise, except it illustrates the importance of the understory or the herbaceous vegetation that is upregulated or greening quite much earlier than what we see, for example, at the mature deciduous forest. It's actually quite a lot like the Hemlock site, which has its seasonal peak uptake, or net uptake, in the spring season, in the early summer. So that's a pretty different seasonal phasing of the carbon uptake period, and it has a different duration, which actually allows it to have some advantages on the annual integral, compared to this green bar, which was larger in summer at the long-term, at the mature site, EMS station. In other words, the Clearcut in the second year following clearing was already as productive over the year as we see at the mature site or at the Hemlock site. So it rapidly recovered. If we look at the net ecosystem balance, we get a very different kind of picture from what you would guess from this GEP response. So again, climate seasons. Notice that the blue bars are always negative, and in the June, July, August season, as well as the annual integral, there's this very large emission, despite that rapid colonization and carbon uptake. So that's indicative of huge respiration, massive respiration that must make up the difference. So this is actually the measured signal. We see a huge amount of carbon being emitted. The question is, what exactly is causing all that emission? And it's actually really not much of a mystery when we consider the amount of coarse woody debris and fine woody debris that was left behind. Roughly 5 kilograms, if you add in the fine woody debris, 6 or 7 kilograms of carbon was left on site per meter squared to decompose following this Clearcut. All of that carbon is being gradually emitted. Actually, it's much less gradual than I had expected. So that's one reason for going into a location to make these sorts of measurements, to try and get whole ecosystem measurements of just how rapidly the site returns to being a sink for carbon, and it's going to, I think, take quite some years, probably 5 years at least. So we'll be continuing to measure this, and it basically illustrates how respiration is 2 to 3 times as large in the clear-cut compared to the mature forest. Again, largely due to this coarse fibrous debris that's decomposing, presumably. We can look at evapotranspiration as well, and I'll take just a quick moment to measure a couple of major themes. First, it was lower after the clearing than it was, immediately after the clearing, than it was the next season. So with the growth of leaf area and growth of vegetation, evapotranspiration has increased during the summer season. But we also see, again, this very interesting early season increase in evapotranspiration relative to what we see in the more mature forest, even compared to the hemlock side. So it's a bit of a puzzle what exactly is causing that, and that's something we need to explore. It could just be early breeding and a phenological response. Andrew Richardson and I were talking a little bit about that recently and how we might try to absorb it. But we also see relatively high evapotranspiration in the fall season, September, October, November, such that the annual integral in the clear-cut is actually higher in the second year than over this large mature forest. This is, to me, a major puzzle. It's not because of growing season increases, perhaps slightly higher, but it's really because of what's happening outside of the main center of mass for the growing season. So very high water use in a recent clear-cut, counterintuitive, at least to me. So the basic conclusions are these: that evaporation was initially low in the clear-cut, but that it rapidly recovered, and that spring evapotranspiration is very high in this clear-cut, true in the fall as well. We see large carbon emissions, and this is despite the rapid revegetation and carbon sequestration associated with gross ecosystem productivity, which is offset by the ecosystem respiration, which is off the charts. And this is largely due to the coarse woody debris and the fine woody debris gradually decomposing. So we're doing a whole bunch of additional things this year and this summer with some REUs. We're going to be exploring the rate of respiration of the soils and the coarse woody debris to try and pin down another piece of this broad puzzle. We're making leaf scale measurements with chambers, trying to characterize the leaf scale physiology of all major actors in the landscape. So a whole host of additional activities, and in a sense, this talk is a chance to invite folks to come participate if interested. We can do a lot of interactive work, and I hope this will become a long-term site at Harvard Forest. So sorry I had such a short moment, but that's all I have time for today. Thanks.